Welcome to the Oral History Podcast, which features stories from the oral history website voicesofoklahoma.com, where Oklahomans have given generously of their time to tell their life story for present-day listeners and for the generations to come. Our entire collection is available at voicesofoklahoma.com. By subscribing to our podcast, you will be notified of new Oklahoma oral history podcasts. So now listen to another interesting storyteller from voicesofoklahoma.com.
Tulsa native Henry R. Kravis co-founded the global investment firm Kohlberg Kravis Roberts and is the co-chairman and co-chief executive officer. The firm pioneered the development of the management buyout. The Kravis name is embedded in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Philbrook Museum of Art's 75,000 square foot Kravis wing was named in honor of Henry's father, Raymond F. Kravis, and Gilcrease Museum houses the Kravis Discovery Center. Henry's mother, Bessie Roberts Kravis, was founder of the Tulsa Urban League, a member of the Tulsa Jewish Federation, and a promoter of the arts. Raymond F. Kravis, the father of Henry, was an oil and gas consultant and a philanthropist. He was a board member of the St. John Medical Center Foundation and was on the executive committee of the Boy Scouts of America. Radio station KRAV-FM was founded by Henry's brother, George Kravis, who died in February 2018. Drawing on the example of his parents, Henry Kravis is known as a major New York City philanthropist for several cultural and educational institutions. Listen to Henry Kravis talk about the influence of his parents, how the family came to America, and the start of KKR. Available only on the oral history website, voicesofoklahoma.com.
Today's date is September 6, 2019. My name is John Erling. Henry, would you state your full name, please?
Henry R. Kravis.
Your date of birth?
January 6, 1944.
And that makes your present age?
75.
We should say I am visiting you by phone. I'm in the studios for Voices of Oklahoma in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And where are you?
I'm in my office in New York.
Well, we don't have time, obviously, to cover your entire career in business. We want to talk about you personally and your family, but your company name?
It's Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, or better known as KKR.
For our listeners, there's plenty of material, magazines, TV, movies, books. Maybe you have, but you should write a book.
No, I've been offered that many times, and so far I said, it's too early in my career to do that.
Right. Let's just describe it briefly. It's a global investment firm, and what is it you manage?
Back in the 1960s, the late 60s, Jerry Kohlberg, George Roberts, and I were all partners at Bear Stearns in New York, part of the partnership there, and we loved focusing on what is now called private equity, in those days called bootstrap acquisitions. But Bear Stearns was very much a sales and trading firm with a mentality of short-term, and we were much more long-term oriented in our investments. What we created back in the late 60s was a plan to buy companies that have long-term patient capital and improve those companies, making them operate more efficiently, hopefully better earnings, and certainly at the same time growing not only the top line, but growing employment as well. So we first started out by buying some public companies, took them private. We bought some small private companies and kept them private that had been family-oriented. The idea was to have this patient capital to be able to make these investments and build a business that really could sustain the future, and was in the time we sold our shares in any company, we would hope that it would be in much better shape than when we bought it. To give you an example of all of that, early acquisitions we made while we were at Bear Stearns were companies like Bourne Clay Products, just outside of Greensboro, North Carolina. We bought a company called the L.B. Foster Company, which was a oil field drilling rental business. They rented rail and piling. Both of those companies had been privately owned. We bought them and then proceeded to make them better than when we found them. We also bought a group of subsidiaries from Rockwell, and that became a company called Incom International. There's a group of industrial companies. And we bought from the Singer Corporation a group of industrial companies they owned, and that was called Vapor Corporation. So those were our very early acquisitions before we started KKR. In 1976, we decided that we would like to just focus on what I'll now call private equity, because in the days when we started this, we were the only ones that were doing it. There was nobody else doing it, and they were called bootstrap acquisitions or leveraged buyouts, management buyouts, and eventually they became known as private equity. So we use the term private equity when I'm describing all of this. We decided to leave Bear Stearns and just focus on the private equity, which is what the three of us wanted to do. We went out to raise a $25 million fund in 1976. First person we went to see was a man by the name of Henry Hillman, who had put money up to start Kleiner Perkins, the venture capital firm. We had read about him, didn't know him, but we got an appointment with him, and we went down and met with him, and lo and behold, he said, I really like what you're doing, and I'll take half of the fund. And we thought, wow, that's terrific. We're going to be in business. Well, not so quick, because, one, we didn't know where to raise the other $12.5 million, and we had been working while we were at Bear Stearns to make the acquisitions. We would go to the Prudential Insurance Company, Mass Mutual, Connecticut General, and a couple of others, and several banks. So we went to the Prudential and said to them, look, this is what we want to do. We're going to do this on our own, not part of Bear Stearns. We'd like you to be an investor in our fund. And they said, look, you've made us a lot of money in past deals that we've done with you. We like what we see, and absolutely no problem at all, except. And the except was they wanted to be the investment committee. George Roberts and I, you have to understand, both of us were 32 years old when we started KKR. Jerry was 20 years older in 1976. And so George and I looked at each other and said, look, we're not leaving the partnership at Bear Stearns to go work for the Prudential Insurance Company, even though it's a fine firm, but we're entrepreneurs. We want to make our own mistakes and our own success, and we want to decide that and not have an institutional investor decide. And we also knew how difficult at times they could be on deciding whether to invest or not. So we said no. And so we had no office. We had left the partnership at Bear Stearns. We had no money. In fact, when we started KKR, I put up $10,000, which is all the money I really had. George Roberts put up $10,000, which is all the money he had. And Jerry, being 20 years older, had a little more money, and he put up $100,000. So we started the firm with $120,000. Now, to put this all in perspective, today we have about $210 billion of assets at the firm, and we have a market cap of about $22.5 billion now that we're a publicly traded company. But coming back to the other, when we couldn't raise the fund, George and I said, okay, how much money do we think we need to stay in business, cover our overhead? And we figured probably $500,000 would be the right number in 1976. We'd have two offices. George would be in San Francisco, and Jerry and I would be in New York. We said, well, why don't we go out to 8 individuals or institutions and say, we'd like you to give us $50,000 a year for 5 years, which was $400,000. We figured that if we were able to buy a company, we'd get a fee from that company for putting a deal together, and that would be our contribution to our overhead. Actually, we found 7 people, and what we offered them for their $50,000 per year for 5 years, we'd show them every transaction that we would do. If they decided to come in to any particular investment we were about to make, and it was their choice on a deal by deal, we wanted a piece of the profit, if there was one. George's background, his father was in the oil and gas business in Houston as an independent oil and gas operator. My father, Raymond Kravis, was a petroleum engineer. In those days, there was something called a third for a quarter in the oil business, which meant that if I went to somebody with money and I had a lease on some property and wanted to drill a well, I would say, I'll put up 25% of the money, you put up 75%, and in return for the 75%, my showing you the deal, we wanted a carried interest in effect. We wanted 1/3 of the cash flow for our 25%. That was called a third for a quarter. It was standard in the oil business, and we thought, well, that's probably good enough where we could actually charge that, but we had one small problem. We didn't have 25% of the money to put into any one deal. So we thought about it, and we said, Well, how does 20% or 25% of the profits sound? Once the investors get their money back, we'd split the profits 80-20 or 75-25. We said that's probably good since there was no precedent at the time as to what the number should be. We wanted to get started, make sure we could actually raise the money. We chose 20%. Now, when I tell people in the hedge fund business or in the private equity world this story, they say to me, well, why didn't you pick 25%? Because that would have stuck. And I said, well, that's fine for you to say, but we had no money and no job at the time. We were just trying to get started, and George and I were 32 years old. That got us started. We went back to Henry Hillman and said, this is the way we're going to do it now. And he said, I want 2 units of the 7 that you're going to raise because I want to be able to invest more. And we said, fine. He came in. My father came in for a unit, $50,000 to cover overhead. We had a fellow from Oklahoma City that had some bowling alleys, and he came in. Then we got a few people out of Chicago and out of New York. So that's how we got started. And after about a year, that was 1976, May 1st. And then in 77, we ended up buying 3 companies. The end of that year, one of our investors, Bill Graham, who was the CEO at Baxter Labs, called me and he said, Henry, I don't know which deals to go into or not. I've gone into all 3. They all look good, but you're going to break me. So he said, I'd suggest you go out and raise a fund. So we talked about it amongst Jerry, George, and myself and decided, okay, let's go give it a try, see if we can raise $25 million. We got lucky, and we were able to raise $35 million. We got First Chicago and Continental Illinois, 2 banks in Chicago to come in. Then some other institutions came in, and that's how we put that first fund of $35 million together.
Young people listening to this, sounds pretty easy, but there must have been times you made a call and you were told no, you were rejected.
Well, no question about it. You know, when you're an entrepreneur, you have to decide you're going to either get through the wall or over the wall, but there'll always be a wall there. And you've got to be prepared to accept rejection. Not everybody's going to love what you're doing. Not everybody's going to understand what you're doing. I had friends of my dad that I talked to, and they'd say, oh, it's interesting, but you'll never make it. This won't work. So they never came in, and it was disappointing to me because I knew they had plenty of money, but they didn't want to take it on. They were, I guess, a little sorry after a while, but we figured out how to get it done. And being an entrepreneur means you've got to be scrappy. You've got to figure out, okay, what's my end goal? What's the objective? And how are we going to get there? That's what George and I, being young entrepreneurs, were able to do. And you're exactly right that you got to be able to accept rejection. Don't take it personally. That's okay. No big deal. And go on, which is exactly what we were able to do.
And then the area of risk. Obviously, you took risks, and people starting businesses or at any time want to grow a business. Risk is a big factor.
Without a doubt. First of all, as I said earlier, no one was doing buyouts. Nobody even knew what we were doing. We'd show up. We had to explain how it would work. In fact, the first public company that we bought, we were filing with the SEC, and they couldn't figure out what we were doing. They said, who's buying whom here? We don't understand the structure. We don't understand anything. So we actually had to get our lawyers to diagram it as to where the money was flowing, who was buying whom, and so forth. The SEC had never seen anything like it. They didn't even know how to opine on it at the beginning. But you've got to just say, okay, we're so convinced this makes sense, and stick with it. So what happened was, yes, you're taking risk. You're taking risk in a number of different ways. You're taking a risk by, okay, I gave up a very good job at Bear Stearns, as did George. We were part of the partnership. We had a great future there from what everybody had told us. And yet we said, no, we don't have any money, but we're going to go out on our own and see if we can make a go of it. So that was risk number one. We didn't know if we could. Nobody had ever done a private equity fund. We were real pioneers of setting terms and setting out how you'd invest. The second risk that always comes is when we buy a company, we'd put up $1 of equity, and for every $1 of equity we would put up, we'd borrow as much as $30 of debt. Now, in the early days, you could do that. You were buying companies for much less than you pay today for a company as far as a multiple of earnings. As a result, you were able to put much less equity in, borrow money on a long-term basis, and that's what we did. For example, we bought the Safeway chain of supermarkets, and we paid $5.6 billion to buy that company in about 1985. We put up about $126 million of equity, and we borrowed around numbers $5 billion of debt against it. Now, we ended up making over 50 times our money on the last investments we made. But, you can't do that today, because today all you could borrow is about 6 to 7 times debt to EBITDA, which is earnings before depreciation, taxes, and amortization. So if you pay 12 times to buy a company, 12 times EBITDA, and you can only get 6 times debt against it, you're going to have to come up with 6 times equity. So that gets you to your 12 times all in. So in that case, that would be half equity and half debt. So that idea of 30, 40 to 1, 50 to 1 almost in some cases, that went out the window back in about 2000, something like that. Today, companies are capitalized on a much more conservative basis. The risk is not as great. And also today, what you have is a capital structure that obviously has less debt, much more equity, but also the covenants in the debt are very loose. You don't have all the covenants that you used to have back in the 1970s and the 80s and even for the 90s for that matter. You got a lot of leeway. You don't have to meet certain working capital or debt to EBITDA or debt to net worth covenants that we used to have to do. Those are all gone now. Risk plays an important role, yes.
The concept then of buyout was your concept. People weren't doing that.
Right. That's right. We started it. There was nobody doing it at the time. In fact, for years, nobody understood what we were doing, which is great. I sort of like that. In fact, I liked it more than I like it now because now practically every country in the world has private equity. Banks will lend. People have set up private equity firms, or there are others outside that are investing in companies. If you had asked me when we started, you think you'll invest in China? I said, you got to be kidding me. China is a communist country. You think you'll invest in Vietnam? Well, we were at war with Vietnam not so much earlier than when we started KKR. You think you'll buy a company in Serbia or Ethiopia? I said, absolutely not. Lo and behold, we bought companies all over the world. The idea of private equity has proliferated enormously today. As I say, there's probably not a bank anywhere in the world that doesn't lend against private equity to help somebody buy a company. Now, since the Stone Age, people would put up a little bit of equity and borrow as much as they could. They wanted to start a corner grocery store or whatever it is. That's how you got going. So there's nothing new to that, but what was new is we were able to commercialize it. We were able to make it into a business. We were able to get pension funds, both state pension funds and corporate pension funds, insurance companies, banks, and others to give us money to go into funds. We would end up with, as I said, our first fund was $35 million that we successfully raised. Today, a fund size for us, say in the U.S., might be $14 billion for the U.S. fund. Asia was close to $10 billion and so forth. Today, it's just a different business. Everybody understands it. And what's interesting about it today, particularly, is there are a lot of institutions that say, look, I need to get returns because I have a pension fund. I need to get 7 or 8% just to meet my liabilities that I have to meet the obligations for the pensioners. It's hard to get 8% today on a consistent basis. So more and more pension funds and others are investing in private equity because historically those returns have been significantly better than the stock market has been, than the debt market, than real estate, than infrastructure investing, et cetera. Now, there's higher risk involved, but if you diversify, which everybody does, and they're not putting all their eggs in one basket in one deal or with one firm necessarily, they can do very well. So give you an example of how have we done. For 43 years, which we started in 1976, investing really 77 was our first full year of investing, call it 42 years, we have a 26% compounded rate of return before we take out our profit participation and before the fees that come to us where the institutions are paying us, which nets out to about 19% for the institutions. That's been over a long period of time. And they look at it and say, well, there's no way I can get that kind of return in other asset classes. And so that's why it's become a very popular asset class. We've been able to raise a lot of money. And now a lot of individuals are also saying they would love to be able to participate in private equity. And it's not that easy to do unless you have enough money, because these are private funds. You've got to be able to hold the investments for a long time and so forth. But even having said that, institutions are saying, I'll take your money, I'll invest it, and we're going to put a lot of money into the private equity arena.
While Wall Street was beginning to know you, they really got to know you. In 1988, you engineered the buyout of RJR Nabisco.
Right.
A book and a film made of the buyout, Barbarians at the Gate. Purchase price was over $24 billion, highest that had been paid for a commercial enterprise up to that time.
Actually, it turned out all in with the debt and everything, about $30 billion was what that turned out to be.
Then in 2007, you surpassed your own record with the $45 billion acquisition of Energy Future Holdings. It was the biggest corporate takeover in history.
That is correct at the time. That's right.
The Barbarians at the Gate, were you comfortable with film that was made of that and the book? How did that make you feel as that all became so public?
Well, it's interesting. The book, when they decided to write the book, they talked to us, and actually, as I read that book, once it was completed by Brian Burroughs, I learned some things that I didn't know, because I didn't know, obviously, what the other side was doing all the time. So it filled in some gaps for me. The book itself, I have to say, was fairly accurate. It was a good book. It was interesting. I'm not sure I would have used a title. I wasn't crazy about that title. We always had to explain we're really not barbarians, but it's okay. I've been called worse, so that's okay. And in Germany, they call us locusts. So barbarian and locust, and God knows what else I've been called. It's okay. It's what it is. We got through it, and I would always say the good part about it, when it was just the newspapers writing about it, I said, well, thank God they haven't made a book. And, of course, they then write the book, Barbarians at the Gate. And I said, well, good part about it is they haven't done a movie. Lo and behold, Ray Stark bought the rights to the book and did a movie. Now, the movie was not accurate at all. He kept sending me the script, and I kept sending it back to him, and I said, you're way off base. You've got to get this in much better shape, and he rewrote it once and sent it back the second time. I said, you're better, but you still aren't even close. He said, look, Henry, I'm going to go with it. It really doesn't matter. It's just entertainment. So don't get too excited about the movie. The book, as I say, was fairly accurate. And back up a second. The first few years when we were buying companies in the 80s, let's say the first 10 or so years of KKR, every article that was written, we walked on water. Now, that's crazy. You can't do that. It's not going to be, and we didn't walk on water, and that doesn't last forever anyway. So I'll never forget, one day I picked up the New York Times. I was on my way to work, and I look on the front page of the business section, and it says, crack in the house that debt built, KKR has a problem. Well, we had a small company that was called Siemens Furniture. The company wasn't doing as well as we had hoped. It got caught in a cycle in an economic downturn, and as a result of that, we were having some issues with it. But I never forget, when I read that, my heart just sunk. I thought, oh, God. And that was the first bad article we've had. Now, over time, you learn that, they're going to write what they're going to write. Forbes had a picture of me one time with my head on a platter. That was all. It was just that. My name wasn't even mentioned in the magazine. There was no article about me, not anything. So I called Steve Forbes and I said, tell me, why is it that I'm on the cover like this? I don't appreciate that at all. He said, look, Henry, I'm just trying to sell magazines. You're a known business figure. That was it. That was his only explanation. I've had good articles written, and whenever you have a good article written, there's going to be a bad one coming somewhere. And I've had bad ones written, and you say, well, so they've written a bad one, it's another one, so what? As long as no one ever says that I'm not honest, that I'm not straightforward, I'm not a man of my word, and have the highest integrity, which I do, that they're going to write what they're going to write. I'll give you an example of that also. 1 year after we bought RJR Nabisco, the Financial Times decided they wanted to make us Men of the Year, George Roberts and I. We weren't quite sure why they were making us Men of the Year. Then we bought a big company, but I have a saying, don't congratulate us when we buy a company. Any fool can buy a company, just pay enough. But anyway, they decided that they would write this article, make us Men of the Year. Reporter comes in to see me. He's interviewing me, and he finishes, and he said, my God, you're nothing like I thought you were. I said, well, what do you think I was? You thought I had 2 heads and horns and all? He said, yeah, just about. He says, because I didn't know you. And that's the problem. So today, we do spend time with the press. We get to know them. We invite them in here to meet all of our people. When there's not a secret, there's nothing to hide, all of a sudden they say, gee, you guys are normal people. You're doing business as you should, and you're honest, and so forth. So people are going to write. I don't get too excited about it one way or the other now. As I said, once I got over that one problem, the article about Siemens Furniture, it really hadn't bothered me that much. I didn't enjoy going through the Arjo and Nabisco press time, but it's what it was. I guess it goes with the territory.
Yeah. By the way, we should point out that George Roberts is your cousin, and you share the same grandfather, right?
That's exactly right. George is my closest friend. He's my first cousin. George and I grew up together. He grew up in Houston. I grew up in Tulsa. We'd spend holidays together, our families, or when we got older, they'd send me down to Houston to be with him, or he'd come up to Tulsa to be with me. His father and my mother were brother and sister. That's how we are related. We went to college together. We've been friends since age 2. We met then. It's a unique relationship. George is extremely bright. He's much quieter than I am, not as outgoing. He's thoughtful, etc. And he and I have the best relationship imaginable because if you have a common objective, you don't worry about who gets credit for anything and you're pulling for the other person. If you respect that person and you have a common set of values and don't worry about who's going to get credit for something, you can go a long way. And George and I have been co-CEOs of KKR for 43 years now. I like to tell the story when George was visiting me, and I guess I was 7 years old, and I had a new bicycle that had arrived for Christmas. He came up after Christmas, and I wanted to ride my new bicycle, and he wanted to ride my new bike. So I got into a little fight with him, and I got chased inside the house by the housekeeper. As she was chasing me in the house, she said, go straight, and then she said, no, turn right. And I turned right into the corner of a wall and cracked my head open and had 26 stitches. And that's the last fight we've ever had. George and I get along really well. If we disagree on something, and those times come up, obviously, we talk about it. We air our differences in private, talk about those, and say, okay, let's figure out how to work through this. It's a unique relationship. We went to college together. Both of us were at Claremont McKenna College in California. We both majored in economics. George is 4 months older than I am, so it turned out that he was a year ahead of me in college. I started after my freshman year. He started after his junior year. But we would drive cross-country to come to New York. He worked at Bear Stearns. I worked at Goldman Sachs. We'd ride together in the car. We roomed together when we were in New York. And we learned the business growing up together. It's been a unique relationship and one that when people say, well, you can't ever have co-heads of a company, well, it depends on who the two people are. But I'll tell you, in our case, it has worked exceptionally well. There's never been one time that either has said, well, let's forget it. We're not going to continue together. It just hadn't been the case.
Right. Can you tell us about your paternal grandparents? I believe a grandfather immigrated from Russia. Is that true?
Yeah. On my mother's side, the family came from Latvia. And on my father's side, the family had come from Russia. On my father's side, they then moved to London. My father, Ray, was born in London in 1901. When he was about 3 or 4 years old, the family moved to Atlantic City in New Jersey. My grandfather, his father, opened a retail store on the boardwalk. In those days, a lot of people from Tulsa and other cities would come to Atlantic City. They'd walk on the boardwalk, and a lot of people would go into my grandfather's store. My dad had gone from Atlantic City to college at Lehigh University and graduated with a degree in mining engineering. My grandfather, his father, said to one of the customers that would come in all the time during the summers, who had a petroleum engineering firm in Tulsa, said, you know, my son has graduated as a mining engineer. Would you have a job for him? And he said, sure. So my grandfather said, you should go to Tulsa. My father saved up some money, and he went out in his very early 20s, gets out to Tulsa, and it turns out the guy had no job for him. So there he is out in Tulsa. He doesn't have enough money to get back to Atlantic City, so he's there. He found another job with a petroleum engineering firm, small one. It turned out that fellow was an alcoholic that ran it, so my father couldn't wait to get out of that. So he got out of that and found another petroleum engineering firm and worked for them for a while. And he was able to work for people like Tom Slick, who was a big independent oil and gas operator. And he did some work in the early days with Sunray DX, Forest Oil, and some others. He told his clients, he said, I'm going to be leaving and starting my own firm. He was 34 years old when he started his firm. And they said, well, we're going to come with you. And he said, no, you can't do that because you're really a client of the firm where I work. You're not my client. They said, well, the only reason we're there is because of you. So they went with him, and that's how he got started, Raymond F. Kravis and Associates. He met my mother in Tulsa. My mother's family, as I said, was from Latvia. My mother was actually born in Muncie, Indiana. Her father, George Roberts was his name, too, had moved to Muncie and opened a hotel in Muncie called the Roberts Hotel. Her older sister was born in Latvia. Then her father decided to get in the oil business and had moved to Tulsa. My father and my mother met on the steps of the Tulsa Public Library. At the time, my mother was 16 years old. My dad was 6 years older, I guess. She said, no, I'm not going to go out with you until I reach a certain age. So he kept waiting, and the time came, and then they started dating, and then they got married, and they were married for almost 63 years and had a wonderful marriage, wonderful relationship, and gave me incredible values. They were warm, loving parents. I was the second child of two, George Kravis, my brother, who was 5.5 years older. In a way, I guess I was lucky because they smothered him. They had lost their first child in crib death. So then when George was born, they were really concerned to make sure he was okay, and they sort of smothered him. I was fortunate because coming 5.5 years later, they sort of left me alone. And I somehow had a gene that was given to me, which was one of independence. I remember one day, I was about 3 years old, and I'm sitting on the floor trying to tie my own shoes, and my mother looked at me and said, what are you doing? I'll help you. And I said, no, I'm going to do it myself. She said, but you don't know how to tie your shoes. And I said, I'll figure it out. That's the way I've sort of lived my life. I figured it out. When I got a job, which I'd go out and I found most of the jobs myself once I got past high school and early days of college, I actually started out never worrying about what was my path going to be. So my path was interesting. All I said was just put me in, coach. I'll figure it out. If I do a good job, you'll notice me. I started out in the summers. My first summer job was in Tulsa when I was 17. I worked for Sunray DX Oil Company in their mailroom and picked up mail, delivered mail for their corporate headquarters. I went to school in Tulsa up to the 8th grade, and then I went on to Eaglebrook School in Deerfield, Mass. for 2 years, which only goes to the 9th grade. Then I went from there to Loomis Chaffee School, and I was there 10th, 11th, and 12th. Then from there, I went out to Claremont McKenna, majored in economics. As I said, I drive cross-country every summer and worked down on Wall Street at Goldman Sachs.
Which elementary school did you go to in Tulsa?
Actually, Lee School for 1 year. And then I went to Barnard from first grade on. I went to Edison Junior High.
Your mother's name?
Bessie Roberts.
And then your father's name is?
Raymond F. Kravis.
He was a philanthropist and oil and gas consultant. Is that true?
He was both. He was a petroleum engineer. He did oil and gas reserve reports for the different investment banks. Do the oil and gas reserve reports for companies. The reason I say for the investment banks, if they were about to do a debt offering or an equity offering for a company in the oil business, you need a reserve report to say, well, what are you borrowing against here? Or what are you going to invest in? So he do the reports. I learned more about my dad once I came to New York and was Goldman Sachs, because my dad never really talked much about what he was doing. Everybody I met in New York would say, your father's the best petroleum engineer in the country, by far. I was very proud to hear that. You know, my dad was so humble, he would never toot his own horn. So as I got older, I didn't talk to him and ask him questions, a lot of which I had learned from others that would tell me what he had done or how he had worked with him. For example, he told me this story, and then it was in a book. He got the Kennedy family, Joe Kennedy family, started in the oil and gas business, President Kennedy's father. One day my dad was in New York and comes back from his meetings to the hotel, and there's a message for him to call Ambassador Joe Kennedy. He didn't know him. He thought one of his friends was playing a joke on him, so he didn't call back. The next day, Joe Kennedy calls again, and he gets my dad, and he said, "Don't you return your phone calls?" He's sort of a gruff guy, and my dad said, "Well, I'm sorry, Mr. Kennedy. I actually thought it was a joke. I mean, I didn't know you would call me because I don't know." He said, "Well, let me tell you the reason I'm calling. Your name's been given to me as the best oil and gas person in the country, and I've decided that I would like to invest in the oil and gas business. You know, I've been in the merchandise mart. I've been in the liquor business. I've had other investments, but I haven't been in the oil and gas business, so I want to figure out how to be in the oil and gas business, and I want somebody to guide me through it." So my dad met with him. They became partners in an oil and gas company. They remained friends until Joe Kennedy passed away. My dad was a friend of President Kennedy. In fact, Ted Kennedy, one of his early jobs was in Tulsa. Joe Kennedy had called my dad and asked him to get Teddy a job because he said somebody in the family's got to know something about the oil industry. So Teddy came out to Tulsa and didn't stay very long, thought he learned everything he needed to learn, I guess, in a few weeks, and he left. But there was a close relationship with the Kennedy family there. My father one day gets a call from a friend of his, and he said, "I don't understand your bemuddled thinking." And my dad said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "Well, have you seen the Wall Street Journal today?" My dad hadn't read it yet. He said, "Well, look at it, open it up." So he opens it up, and there's a big picture of Jack Kennedy for president, and there are 50 professional businessmen and women from around the country for him. So my dad calls Joe Kennedy, and he said, "Joe, what the heck's this about? You know, I'm a Republican. I've been a Republican my whole life," he said, "and nobody called me to ask me, was this okay to do?" Joe Kennedy says, "Very simple, Ray, anybody that's a friend of mine is a friend of Jack's." And that was the end of the conversation. So there was that relationship. My dad taught me a lot about treat people as you'd want to be treated. It didn't matter who they were or where they were. I used to see how he treat the elevator starter at the First National Bank of Tulsa. I'd see how he treat people at the country clubs, in the locker room, the caddies, on the golf course. And it didn't matter who you were. He treated everybody with respect. And I learned a great lesson by just watching that, and fortunately picked up most of that. And my dad always wanted to help people in need, and it's exactly what I do. My wife and I give an enormous amount of money away every year. We give it for education. We give it for medical science and research. We give it for the arts. It's just something that has been in my blood for a long, long time. I get as much pleasure out of that as I do from my day-to-day business, quite frankly. You can see where you help somebody in need. It doesn't matter whether it's a young kid who you're helping with their education, putting them through school, and you see what can come of that. I'm a big believer that in education, all you want to do is give somebody a chance. If somebody's educated, they can never take that away from you. You can lose your money, you can lose your health, but you'll never lose that education that you have if you're diligent about it. It's in your mind, it's yours. So I've been a big supporter of various schools. I give a lot of scholarships away every year. I am currently chairman of Sponsors for Educational Opportunity, which is an 8-year program in New York and in San Francisco, which takes kids in the 9th grade through college. And it's one of the very few programs that's a through college program, an 8-year program. About 80% of our kids graduate from college in 4 years, and 95% graduate in 6 years or less. These are all minority kids, come from household incomes of $33,000 or less. I've really enjoyed building that up and helping. It's been around 55 years, so I took it over when it was 50 years old. I started a drug and substance abuse program in the middle schools in New York to help kids overcome drug use. My wife and I at Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York, we gave them about 5 years ago a $100 million grant to start a Center for Molecular Oncology, which is state-of-the-art in understanding mutations and which drugs go with which mutations to kill the mutations that cause the cancer. At Rockefeller University, I built a huge science center with 25 new labs, Rockefeller University is one of the foremost research institutions in the country. There are more Nobel Prize winners there than there are at any other university, whether it's Harvard or MIT or Caltech or whatever. So those are the kinds of things I like to do in the arts. We've given an enormous amount of money both to the Metropolitan Museum in New York and to Museum of Modern Art in New York. My wife, Marie-José, was president for 15 years at MoMA. She's also today chairman of Sloan Kettering Research Institute, which is part of Memorial Sloan Kettering. It's all the research side of that institution. We do a lot of things together and separately, but both of us believe very strongly in philanthropy, and I don't like to use the term give back. I didn't take anything from society. I like to give, so it's not a question of giving back. It's a question of helping those in need and helping those institutions become the greatest institution that they possibly can be. So in my case, I love starting new not-for-profits, or I like fixing not-for-profits and making them much better. What I'm not particularly interested in or good at is just being involved with an institution where I can't make a big difference. So I try to find those institutions where actually I can make a difference and be real value added. I started something in New York about 23 years ago, which was called the Fund for New York City. I started thinking about what is missing in New York. I wanted the private sector and the public sector to work together. When I think about what the private sector has done for cities and how they built a good network, I think of cities like, in those days, Minneapolis was great, Kansas City being another, but New York was certainly not one of those cities. Everybody did their own thing and didn't really work together. So I had an idea that I wanted to go out and raise $100 million. I wanted to go to 100 people and raise $1 million each, no more, no less, and help our community by helping businesses in the inner city. And if we could create jobs and create value in those companies where they could be sustainable, then I thought we would be helping the city dramatically. And that's exactly what we did. The first 53 people I called on, I raised $52 million at $1 million each. I stopped raising money at that point because I was worried that we couldn't put it to work intelligently. I said, let's stop, let's see how we can do. We never raised any more money. We today have about $150 million in that fund. It's just from making money on some of the investments that we have made to date. I'm very proud of that. And I started a drug and substance abuse program for the middle schools in New York to help the worst performing schools. That was great. Finally, I stopped it because I didn't want to really go out and raise a lot of money for it, but I liked the concept and it worked. It basically was to replicate what my parents did for me, but do that in the inner city, because most of those kids are lucky if they have one parent. They don't have two parents, and that one parent, it'll be a mother in most cases, and if they're lucky, that parent has an 8th grade education. Getting through middle school, making sure they weren't on drugs was a very important part of what I wanted to do there, and it worked. It was a very successful program. These are things that I really enjoy doing. I guess I got that gene from my father particularly, but both my mother and father were very philanthropic, very willing to help people in need. And as I made more money, I said, I want to make sure that I can help people. And hopefully I'm going to get a lot of pleasure out of doing that. It's exactly what happened.
You draw a lot of values, Oklahoma values, through your parents. Your father was very involved in Tulsa, and so was your mother. I have a list here. He was a board member of the St. John Medical Center Foundation, on the executive committee of the Boy Scouts of America, many others. And then a $52 million performance center named in his honor in West Palm Beach, to show how people really respected him. And so you are, in many, many ways, a fortunate person, but it all started in Tulsa with your parents.
Without a doubt. People always ask me, so how do you think about the values that you have? And how do you think about the way you're driven and all? And I said, I can point back to the greatest mentor that I possibly could have ever had, and that was my dad. He was very proud of me. I was headstrong, and of course, when you're young and you think you know better than your parents, he and I used to clash. But then when I finally cooled down, in a calm moment, I'd start to think about it, and I'd say, he's probably right. In hindsight, as I've now have children and grandchildren, I look back and I said, was he and my mother right? My mother used to have a saying, and I always remembered it. I said, look, you're going to Europe, and I'd love to go with you. And when I was much younger, she'd always say, you have to earn the right. And I never quite understood what that meant, earn the right. I said, I've got reasonably good grades at school. I haven't flunked out, and so on. She says, no, when you're ready, you'll know when you're ready, and we'll know when you're ready, and that's when you can go with us. But as far as we're concerned right now, you haven't earned the right to go to Europe with us. So I never went to Europe until I was in business school. I went to Columbia University, to the business school at Columbia. It was after my first year there that I was able to scrape enough money together and buy a cheap ticket, sort of package deal, and go skiing in Europe and go to Europe. And I was so excited about being there. Today, kids go, my gosh, they go at the drop of a hat. They go all over the world today. I didn't do that and couldn't do it because couldn't afford it. My parents gave me terrific values. They gave me the value of self-esteem. They gave me the value of the reward for working hard, paying attention to the goals that you set and work toward those goals and then set new goals and keep pushing those goals out. They gave me a credible value of knowing how to treat other people, always with the thought of treat people like you'd want to be treated. I try to do that always, and it doesn't matter who you are. I don't like those people that only want to be nice to people that they consider they're equal or above them as far as maybe they got money or something like that. I don't buy that for a minute. I've got good friends, the guys in our lobby here at our office building, our security people. I've got friends that are the caddies on the golf course and so forth. I love doing something for these people and just helping them out because they weren't given some of the same opportunities that I have. And when I think about opportunities, a lot of the time you create your own opportunities. When I hear people moaning and groaning, well, this didn't go right, it was that person's fault and so forth, it's not somebody else's fault. Maybe once or twice, but most of the time it's going to be your own fault. You got to take responsibility for your own actions. You're going to have reactions out of those actions. So you've got to keep everything in perspective. That's how I've just lived my life. When I can help somebody who maybe hasn't been as fortunate as I have been, I just get a huge smile on my face. And my wife's exactly the same. She grew up with wonderful values. She's Canadian. Her parents, for example, one Christmas, found out that there was a family that, unfortunately, they'd had an accident in their house. They had a Christmas tree fire, and their Christmas presents were burnt. Her father came home, and she was a young girl at the time, and there were 7 in her family. And he came home, and he said to the whole family, he said, all right, let's put everything we have under the Christmas tree in a box, and we're taking that to this family that has lost everything. She said, I've always remembered that event because he was 100% right. We had things, these people didn't have them, and let's see what we can do to help them out. So in that same vein, recently I read an article about a mother who was robbed, and the money that was taken from her was the money that she had saved for her daughter's college education. Her daughter had gone through her freshman year in college, and it was for the next year. The money had been stolen. And I told my assistant, find out the name of these people, find out where they live, and go take them a check made out to the college. I didn't want to give it to them, but I said, make it out to the college, and I want to take care of this girl's college education, and I do not want them to know who I am. I just want them to know that I read this article and that I care about this girl's education. So it's those kind of things I love doing.
You say you had a good beginning, but you took advantage of every opportunity that came along to you. You had that gene, whatever it is, that helped you. So you had a good beginning, but you were blessed with a good mind. So you put them all together, and then you're able to do all the things that you've just described.
I think that's the fair summation. It's funny. When I was young and I had a paper route, which everybody used to have a paper route, unfortunately, that's gone out the window now with the iPads and all, but paper routes were a great training for me. And then I remember being in the 7th grade at Edison School in Tulsa, and they had a magazine sales event for 2 weeks, I believe it was. And I always wanted to be the number one seller of the magazine subscriptions. I didn't care whether the kid was in high school or junior high. I was going to beat him. And I did. because I just set my mind to it, and I've always been driven. I don't know why. That's just been my life. I've been driven. I want to succeed. I've been blessed that way. I look at that, it's something called grit. There's been a lot of stuff written about what's the most important thing for one to succeed. I've concluded that grit is as big a piece of what will cause a success as anything else. There's lots of people that are just smart as can be, much smarter than I and others, but they don't know what to do. They jump from one idea to the next idea or one job to the next job, whatever it is. And it's that grit, that determination, that fortitude to get you through what you set out to do. That's how I'm built.
Young people listening to this, and I always ask, what kind of advice do you give to young people in college about to set out? You probably already have outlined that in the last few minutes.
I think that's exactly right. That's what I'd say. And I'd say a couple of other things. Number one, your first job, there is no perfect first job. A lot of kids I talk to, they're looking and waiting for that perfect first job. There is no perfect first job. Just get into the workforce and start working. You never can tell where that'll lead. You might be at a cocktail party, or you might be on an airplane, sit next to somebody and start talking to them, and the next thing you know, they offer you a job. And that takes you in a direction that you hadn't even thought about doing. So if you're going to stay at home and hope that perfect job somehow comes across the transom, it probably is not going to happen. So you got to get into the workforce. You got to, give it your best. And that's number one. Number two, I would say to young people, be curious. If I said there's one thing, one trait I'm looking for when I'm hiring young people, I'm looking for people that not only do they have grit, because that's very important, as I've just said, but are you curious? I don't think anyone can be a good investor if you're not curious, because you got to be able to connect the dots. You have to be able to look around the corners, and that's all extremely important. I think for young people, broaden your mind. Put yourself out of your comfort zone. Too many people only want to be with people like them. Don't be with people like you. Be with a lot of different people. Hear different points of view. Too many college campuses today, you see it where somebody comes on a college campus with a different viewpoint than what maybe the faculty has or what some of the students have, and the next thing you know, they boycott the speech or they block the person from going in to give the speech. That's about the worst thing that could happen. I went to college to hear other points of view and to learn and to be able to form my own opinions there. So be open-minded and don't just focus on people like you. We know for sure that the natural bias for people is they look in the mirror and they say, that's who I want to hire. I want somebody like that person, which is themselves. I say, go find somebody totally different to hire. Find a diversity of thought, diversity of gender, and diversity of ethnicity. If you're going to broaden your company or you're going to broaden yourself, it's very important. The last thing I'd say, go to places that you get out of your comfort zone. If you only want to hear rock and roll, go to a classical concert. Go to an opera. Go to museums and train your eye. Because as you go to museums, you'll start to train your eye. Just because a painting says Picasso doesn't mean it's any good. There were good Picassos, there were not good Picassos, and then there were great Picassos. The only way you're going to learn those things is to go out and train your mind and get out of your comfort zone and just learn from that. Read history. History has a tendency to repeat itself. So read history, read novels, and start imagining. Say, wow, I'm living in a fantasy world here by reading this wonderful novel. So those are the things that I would say to any young person that's listening to this.
Well, I want to thank you for this time. I know you're a busy person, but many Oklahomans are proud of your story. So to hear you tell the story on Voices of Oklahoma is very much appreciated. So, Henry, I thank you very much for sharing your story with us today.
Well, thank you very much, John. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and keep up the good work. There are a lot of interesting and wonderful people from Oklahoma going on to do a lot of different things, and I think your endeavor here of bringing out the voices of Oklahoma is something that we'll all be indebted for a long time. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Henry. Appreciate it very much.
Take care.